When I began sitting down with people who had lived for 6 decades or more, I thought I would find a pattern, some neat, repeatable recipe for a life well lived. Instead, I found 1,000 variations on courage, tenderness, and ordinary bravery. I found stories that did not fit the tidy narratives we feed ourselves in youth about success and failure. But that made a different kind of sense, a logic shaped by weathered hands, quiet losses, small mercies, and stubborn hope. These interviews weren't lectures. They were invitations into rooms where people finally felt free to tell the truth about what mattered. If you listen closely, a single life, lived long enough, becomes a handbook of practical wisdom. Here are the lessons elders handed me, not as instructions but as maps to explore in your own way. One woman, Ruth, spent her working years as a nurse. She told me about hands, how they remember in ways the head does not. "You learn to hold both pain and presence at once," she said, and the sentence carried the weight of decades of care. She taught me that presence is not dramatic, it is quiet and repeatable. Showing up, night after night, for someone who is frightened or ill became her moral apprenticeship, and it taught her to tolerate discomfort without trying to fix it. That endurance, she said, is the secret ingredient in love. Presence, more often than eloquence, becomes the measure of a life. Another voice was Henry, a retired machinist whose hands smelled of oil and patience. Henry loved routine. Every morning at dawn he brewed tea, walked 2 blocks, and sat to read the newspaper. He rejected the idea that a meaningful life requires constant reinvention. "You don't have to live a dozen lives," he told me. "You can live one life well." From Henry I learned that fidelity to small rituals, tea, a walk, a daily letter to a friend, builds a scaffold that supports joy. Grand, sweeping transformations make for dramatic stories, but the quiet repetition of simple acts holds a life together. If you want something that lasts, start small and be consistent. Then there was Amina, who immigrated twice and raised 3 children in neighborhoods that tried to make them invisible. She taught me about exile and belonging, about the way identity can be both a wound and a resource. She said that resilience is less about being unbreakable than about learning to be repairable. She had stitches in her heart from grief and stitches in her hands from late-night sewing to make ends meet. And both kinds of mending gave her an intimate knowledge of how to recover. Her advice was blunt and tender. Learn how to repair things. Homes, relationships, seedbeds, yourself. It is an art rarer than it should be, and more necessary than it sounds. Across the stories there was a recurring emphasis on time, but not the hurried sense that governs modern life. Time, for people who have lived through decades, is a different companion. It is not a resource to be optimized, but a landscape in which things deepen. At 20 you think you can hold 100 things, said Daniel, who taught high school history. By 60 you know you can't, and that's peaceful. That peace stems from an unusual clarity, the recognition that many of the anxieties of youth resolve themselves in the currency of years. Careers, reputations, and arguments that once felt epical shrink in proportion. This long view does not make us indifferent. It makes us selective. It teaches what to defend and what to let drift away. Forgiveness comes up more than you would expect. Not as moral abstraction, but as a practical daily habit. People described forgiveness as an economy of ease. Holding on to grievances consumes a surprising amount of energy, and that energy yields nothing you cannot reclaim another way. Margaret, who lost a son to addiction, spoke with a calm that surprised me about forgiving not to absolve, but to unburden herself. "Forgiving doesn't make what happened okay," she said. "It makes room in my heart for the people I still love." Forgiveness, then, is less charity for others and more a reclamation of your own future. Health is a conversation the elders speak about with steadiness and specificity. Many of the mistakes they named were not glamorous: skipped checkups, dismissing early symptoms, choosing work or worry over sleep. What they emphasized instead were habits that compound in the best sense: walking, nourishing food, small consistent movement, and attention to mental health. "Don't wait until your body yells at you," a retired elementary teacher advised. "Start small. Walk a little more. Cut down on sugar. Talk to someone when the nights get long." Small choices made repeatedly become the foundation for decades of autonomy. Health is not a sprint to an ideal body. It is a patient tending so that the years you have are full and useful. Money emerged repeatedly as a pragmatic spiritual issue. People wrestled with it not as a goal but as a tool. They offered a sober counsel. Money matters up to a point, enough for security, a comfortable roof, the ability to help others. But beyond that, it is a poor substitute for the things that truly nourish. Several elders spoke about the irony of hoarding. People who had spent their lives accumulating found themselves lonely with plenty. The more interesting lives were those that spent with intention on experiences, not things. Travel that taught empathy, dinners that built friendships, and small generosity that bound communities. Invest in relationships, the elders said, not in status. Career advice from those who had worked long and often hard was refreshingly simple. Work to learn, not only to earn. Rosa, who had run a bakery for 30 years, said she would have taken more time to teach others rather than protect trade secrets. Her deepest regret was not a missed promotion, but the things the work kept her from. An unfinished conversation with a friend, a child's recital she missed. Career choices should not be detached from the life you intend to live. They should serve that life. If you can invest in skills and people, the dividends will last. Love in all its forms was central to almost every account. The elders rejected the myth that romantic love is the apex of meaning. Instead, they celebrated companionate love, the steady presence that carries someone through illness and long winters. They honored friendships that outlived marriages, the love between siblings that matured into sanctuary, the affection of neighbors who slid casseroles onto porches during hard seasons. Love became a practice, not a prize. Showing up, remembering small dates, apologizing without waiting to be asked, and laughing when things are awkward. "Marriage isn't magic," said a woman in her 80s with a wry smile. "It's the 1,000 tiny mercies you offer each other." That view reframes love as a series of actions rather than an emotion to be possessed. The elders were also candid about loneliness, which is not the same as solitude. Loneliness is a corrosive feeling. Solitude can be restorative. Many described an initial fear of being alone after a spouse's death or a child's move, followed by a period where they learned to be with themselves. Those who flourished cultivated activities and relationships that fed their inner life. Books, art, walks, volunteer roles, and they made sure to be part of communities that matched their values. They counseled younger listeners to build networks now, neighbors, friends, hobby groups, and volunteer positions that can sustain you when family is far or absent. Grief was not politely skirted. People spoke of it directly: the loss of friends, partners, physical capacities, and the sense of youth. The elders' responses to grief were instructive. Rather than trying to outrun pain, they recommended attending to it, finding a listener, a professional, or a ritual that honors what was lost. They observed that grief reshapes the soul, but does not have to define the remaining years. Some described grief as a counselor that opens new capacities for empathy. Others warned against the silent accumulation of grief and recommended small, regular practices: naming the losses, telling the stories, making a ritual each year to remember. Grief handled well becomes a seam through which tenderness is transmitted, not a wound that festers. Curiosity was a recurring delight in these narratives. Plenty of people laughed at the stereotype that curiosity fades with age. The opposite, it seemed, was true for many. Having fewer obligations often opened space for new learning. Several elders described late-life apprenticeships. One learned pottery at 70. Another took up online courses in history. Another taught herself to code to help her grandchildren. Curiosity is a deliberate practice. Read a book about something you know nothing about. Visit a museum. Ask someone younger to teach you the skill they love. Learning keeps the mind supple and offers the joy of discovery without the pressure of performance. Community mattered in ways that often surprised younger listeners. It was less about presence of family and more about chosen proximity to people who sustain you. One man told me he found salvation in a community choir. Another found it in a Saturday morning coffee with the same 4 friends for 20 years. These small gatherings, repeated over time, generated a sense of belonging. The elders urged us to lean into these micro-communities: a walking group, a book club, a volunteer organization. The miracle is cumulative. Every repeated shared experience builds trust. If you want a network that lasts into old age, start building it before you need it. On the subject of technology, the elders' views were practical and nuanced. Some embraced it joyfully. Video calls that spanned continents became lifelines, and online courses opened worlds. Others resisted with healthy skepticism, mindful of screens that steal time. The consensus: use technology as a tool, not as a replacement for embodied life. Learn enough to connect, but don't let it crowd out the sensory experiences that make life rich. A hand on a shoulder, the smell of fresh bread, the cadence of a friend's laugh. Technology can multiply human connection if used intentionally. Otherwise, it fragments attention. Risk and regret featured prominently. Regret was rarely about failed investments or missed fame. It was about small, avoidable omissions. Conversations not had. Trips not taken because of fear. Apologies not offered. One woman who had postponed trips for years to save for one big thing discovered late that the experiences she had craved were affordable earlier and brighter when shared, not commodified. The elders urged audacity in small things. Say the hard words earlier, forgive in time, go to that dance, call the person you miss. Regret shrinks when you prioritize presence over perfection. There was surprising wisdom about pacing. In youth, we often measure life by acceleration. The elders measured it by rhythm. They taught that different seasons require different tempos. There were decades for building, decades for parenting and career, and decades to slow so that attention can widen. Slowing down is not failure. It is an artful mode of perception. When you slow enough to notice the color of a leaf or the peculiar way light falls across a table, you enter a kind of abundance missing from hurried living. Mentorship and passing on knowledge felt urgent to many. Several elders expressed a desire to give what they had learned, not to be lauded, but to be useful. They suggested formal and informal mentorship, teaching a young chef a recipe without secrets, advising a neighbor on saving, or simply sharing stories about failures as well as triumphs. The act of sharing transforms memory into a living resource. If you have wisdom, offer it with humility. If you receive it, pay attention. These exchanges are how traditions and durable values travel forward. Purpose, not productivity, was a phrase I heard again and again. In midlife, we tie worth to output, promotions, salaries, accolades. Later, worth is frequently tied to purpose, being useful in ways that match your values. Seniors who felt purposeful had roles that mattered. A retired teacher tutoring reading, a former gardener volunteering at a community plot, a veteran helping new citizens understand the civic rhythms. Purpose anchors days and gives shape to a life when career ends. If you want longevity of spirit, find a role that fits your capacity and your heart. Death, candidly, was part of these conversations. People spoke about facing mortality not as a final exam but as a companion that clarifies priorities. That clarity produced astonishing generosity. People gave away possessions, but more importantly, they gave away the time that had cost them the least, but mattered most. Don't wait until you're ill to say the things you want said, one elder counseled. The proximity of death reshapes choices, apologizing sooner, reconciling earlier, traveling while you can still relish it. The elders did not counsel morbidness, they counseled intentionality. There were practical lessons, too. Get legal affairs in order, talk about end-of-life wishes, write down family stories, designate power of attorney, and simplify possessions gradually. These administrative tasks do not feel romantic, but they safeguard dignity and ease burdens for loved ones. Doing them is not giving up. It is making room for the important things that remain. Laughter, story, tenderness, creativity, in its many forms, glittered through these narratives. For some it was art. For others it was improvisation, finding new ways to live with limitations. One man took up woodworking after retirement and found that the act of shaping wood mapped onto shaping meaning in life. Another reclaimed a youthful love of jazz, finding that music could break through the rigidities of habit. Creativity offered a route to joy that required no external validation, only curiosity and practice. The elders' political and moral counsel was disarmingly simple. Live with integrity. By that, they did not mean moral purity, but the courage to align action with claim. Small dishonesty, they warned, accumulates like rust. Holding to your word, caring for your neighbor, and offering consistent kindness create reputations that serve you like a warm current in cold weather. Integrity costs in moments, but it pays in trust. Many emphasize the importance of adapting plans. Life seldom follows the script we write. Widowhood, illness, or unexpected joys require rerouting. Flexibility is not a lack of will, but a choice to respond wisely to reality. Plan, but stay able to pivot. Seniors who thrived tended to have contingency plans for housing, health, and finances. They had relationships that could carry them and interests that sustained them when circumstances changed. And finally, a theme that surprised me with its tenderness: delight. Delight is not childish. It is an ethical stance. To be delighted by small things, steam rising from a cup, the errant courage of a neighbor, a joke that lands, means choosing joy as a practice. A woman named Lila kept a small jar for joyful moments. Entries about sun-filled mornings, a grandson's drawing, a stranger's kindness. At the end of difficult weeks, she read them aloud and felt buoyed. Delight cultivated regularly becomes resilience. If there is a single through line in these 60 years of shared stories, it is this: wisdom does not arrive as an epiphany, but as a settled attention to what actually tends to human flourishing. It is learned by living, by failing, by being repaired, and by continuing to try. These elders did not offer a universal recipe because there isn't one. Instead, they offered a set of practices, presence, repair, small consistent habits, community, curiosity, and deliberate generosity that, when woven together, produce a life that feels whole. So how do you use these lessons? Don't try to imitate someone else's life. Instead, test their practices. Begin with a 30-minute promise to yourself each week. Read something outside your usual interest, call an old friend, go to a community meeting, or learn one new skill. Invent a small ritual that marks your days. Make one practical plan, update your will, schedule a checkup, or set aside funds for a modest adventure. Invite someone younger into a friendship and ask them to teach you something. Offer your stories to someone who needs them. Start with tiny experiments. Measure how they change your afternoons, then adjust. No one promised that age would be easy. The years contain sorrow as well as sweetness. But the elders I listened to argued that age also offers an unusual generosity, perspective, fewer illusions, and a clearer sense of what matters. If you lean into that generosity with curiosity and kindness toward yourself and others, you will find that the next chapters can be rich, surprising, and full of meaning. Their lives suggest that the project of living is never finished. It simply changes shape. If you pay attention to the small things, keep learning, forgive, and say the words that matter, you will be passing along a very particular kind of inheritance, a life that taught others how to live. There is no neat formula, only the invitation to be deliberate. These stories are not templates but companions, ways of seeing that make the landscape of your own life clearer. Sit with them, test them, and let the wisdom of 60 years, of ordinary people, their quiet decisions, and their resilient hearts, help you choose what to plant next in your own garden.